Hello, everyone. That was a wonderful introduction. I wanted to begin by thanking Moria for organizing this talk today and to everyone at UPF for all the kind of logistical support that made this talk possible today. So as was already mentioned, I'm going to be giving a talk today on the informatics of resistance. I'll go ahead and pull up the slideshow now. And I'm going to try to limit my talk today to about 40 minutes or so we should have plenty of time at the end to discuss and hopefully go over any questions that people have in relation to the presentation today. So without further ado, I'm going to begin. In 1985, when computers had just begun to be connected en masse to a still nascent global internet, the feminist philosopher Donna Haraway theorized the ways in which the networked management of information would emerge as a new terrain for the enactment of political domination and emancipatory struggles alike. In her essay, A Cyborg Manifesto, Haraway foresaw the ways in which the networked machines that had emerged from Cold War research programs had the potential to catalyze the wholesale transformation of our societies, bringing us from the world of industrial capitalism to a world characterized by what she aptly called the informatics of domination. Haraway's essay resembled science fiction at the time of its publication, and yet revisiting the Cyborg Manifesto more than 3 decades later, it is difficult to overstate how astutely she was able to theorize how information technologies would profoundly reshape our social, economic, sexual, cultural, familial, and political lives. The structures of power in our society, whether organized as nation states, transnational corporations, or social institutions, all now wholly embrace networked computation as the principal means through which they produce and impose their power. The proliferation of communicative technologies has transformed how education is enacted, how populations are managed, how culture is produced, and how markets are run, and has culminated in the emergence of new kinds of societies that are deeply structured by and animated by the mass capture, circulation, and control of data. If our lives today are subjected to and exposed to the informatics of domination that Haraway outlined, how might we begin to imagine a corresponding informatics of resistance? In my talk today, I will sketch a conceptual diagram of power and resistance in 2 parts in an attempt to answer this question. In the first half, I will give a broad account of the historical development of power, outlining the evolution from the disciplinary power of institutions that emerged in the 18th century to the control power of information technologies that are ascendant today. In the remaining half of my talk, I will analyze a range of contemporary practices that I believe we should study and embrace as emancipatory models in the age of informatic domination. My talk today will move quickly in an attempt to make as many connections and give as broad an overview to these questions as possible. And because I'll be trying to cover so much ground today, I think we must approach the presentation today as a kind of map of different concepts and arguments in relation to the subject matter. As I said before, I will limit my speaking time today, so hopefully if there are any questions that arise about any parts of my presentation, we'll have a chance to discuss and kind of sort through that together. The larger claim that organizes my talk today is that power and resistance are mutually constitutive of one another. There is no power without resistance, just as there is no resistance without power. And so the most fundamental task of any theory of power or resistance will always be to diagram how they structurally anticipate and are profoundly formative of one another. Consequently, any meaningful theory of power and resistance must also struggle to theorize their historical dimensions, grasping how distinct regimes of power and practices of resistance have been scaffolded onto and shaped by one another over time. One way of beginning such a theorization is to attempt to diagram the accumulation of power, approaching it simultaneously as a technical and political problem. Each new form of power doesn't erase whatever forms of power preceded it, but rather always elaborates and expands upon already existing forms of power that came before. In this sense, the networked forms of computation that drive the informatics of domination don't emerge in an ahistorical vacuum, but rather were grafted onto diverse sets of already existing and operating technologies, architectures, and traditions. Studying the accumulation of power thus always entails tracing those imbricating processes that fuse different articulations of power together into new regimes, structures, and forms. While sometimes the introduction of a new technology can alter the way power operates, for example, how the development and production of autonomous drones have forever changed the way that wars are waged and police forces operate, at other times, the appearance of new technologies can catalyze far more radical social and political transformations, leading to the formation of profoundly novel regimes of power that follow new rules and logical operations. I will argue today, following Haraway's work, that information technologies have caused one of these radical transformations to occur, so much so that we can all now claim to be living in what we can simply call a control society. In order to begin to define and grasp what a control society is and what it entails for our lives, politics, economies, and cultures, I must first begin by rewinding to the 18th century to describe the emergence of a different kind of society defined not by control, but by discipline, that provided a substrate for the emergence of the informatics of domination 200 years later. Disciplinary power emerged in the 18th century in direct response to the excesses of sovereign forms of power that preceded it. While sovereign power, the power of the state, emerged as early as the 5th century and was historically defined by the power to establish a singular authority over a territory, the power to wage war, the power to expel, and perhaps most fundamentally, the power to kill. Disciplinary power was conceived of as a way of managing populations that didn't necessitate those blunt and violent extremes. Theorized in great detail by the French philosopher Michel Foucault in his book Discipline and Punish in 1975, in disciplinary societies, power is concerned with producing socially compliant, docile, and productive individuals, aiming to reform rather than maim or kill. In disciplinary societies, an individual is compelled to live with an array of enclosed institutions that govern the spatial distribution, activities, and collective force of bodies. The institutions of a disciplinary society are organized on a cellular basis, closed off from one another, yet encouraging passages between and through them over time. In disciplinary societies, a person may begin their life in a hospital maternity ward, and then will progress to a family home and later a school, and eventually they will go on to the enclosed space of a factory, or a military barracks, or perhaps a prison, and then eventually will die and will return back to the hospital morgue. All of the institutions in disciplinary societies, universities, hospitals, churches, prisons, factories, barracks, are founded upon the surveillance and policing of the individual, a form of management which ultimately is internalized by disciplinary subjects. The disciplinary society is perhaps best illustrated by the technology of the panopticon, which we see here, a particular kind of prison which was designed to maximize the visibility of its prisoners. Constructed as stacked rings of prison cells that surround a surveillance tower, all the prisoners in the panopticon can be viewed by a singular guard posted in the central tower. And yet, because the guard is hidden inside of the tower, the prisoners are never able to tell whether they are being watched or not. The panopticon is an exemplary technology of disciplinary power, in the sense that prisoners are compelled to behave as if they are being watched all the time, even when no one may in fact be watching them. They ultimately come to internalize the surveillance of the guards and surveil their own behaviors and thus reform themselves. While a school, factory, or hospital might not seem similar to a prison at first glance, all of the institutions of a disciplinary society function in this same way. One is taught to live as an obedient student, worker, patient, or prisoner by being surveilled and monitored by a teacher, boss, doctor, or prison guard, and eventually internalizing that surveillance. Beyond the institutional surveillance that renders the body visible to disciplinary power, there is also a confessional dynamic which compels individuals to reveal the contents of their interior lives as well. In a doctor's office, you are asked to describe your symptoms. In a court, you are asked to give testimony. In a school, you are asked to give presentations and undergo exams. In a church, you are asked to admit to your sins. And in a psychiatrist's office, you are asked to disclose your neuroses and dreams. In this sense, disciplinary societies produce knowledge about their subjects and use this knowledge to exert power over them, quite literally exemplifying the expression, knowledge is power. While the fear of torture and death haunted subjects living under the blunt violence of sovereign power, it is the fear of being surveilled and ultimately the fear of being known that conditions subjects in disciplinary societies. Just as a prisoner is compelled to behave themselves in the cell to satisfy the prison guard, so too is the student expected to study for the exam on their own to satisfy the teacher, as is the patient expected to take care of their health on their own to satisfy the doctor. Individuals in disciplinary societies are conditioned to watch, govern, and police themselves, effectively distributing the operation of power throughout all of the population. Control power, structured by the informatics of domination, emerged over the second half of the 20th century as networked computation became increasingly prevalent in state institutions, the corporate economy, and everyday life. Control power is scaffolded on top of both sovereign and disciplinary power and operates as a massive intensification and generalization of both of their dynamics. In control societies, power takes shape as the translation of the world into a problem of coding, where anything and everything can be submitted to disassembly, reassembly, investment, and exchange as data on networks. Following the mass production, distribution, and installation of networked computers and databases, it became possible for individuals' behavior to be sensed, stored, and analyzed at unprecedented scales in the form of data, as abstracted sets of numerical values. As Donna Haraway wrote, information is a kind of quantifiable element which allows universal translation, and so unhindered instrumental power that permits lives to be subjected to the informatics of domination. The French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, writing after Haraway in 1989, noted that disciplinary institutions weren't disappearing, but rather were exploding and expanding everywhere, no longer existing as enclosures, but rather as signals and potentials on diffuse and far-reaching networks. Rather than pass from the hospital to the school to the prison as distinct, separate places, as you would in a disciplinary society, in our control society, you can carry the hospital with you everywhere you go as a fitness tracking app on your phone. You can carry your school with you everywhere you go on your laptop, and you can be subjected to the surveillance of the prison everywhere you go, as persistent network surveillance has been installed in almost every kind of public and private space. In these ways, control power and the informatics of domination are best understood not as a replacement for, but rather as a spatial and temporal reorganization of disciplinary power. Controlled spatial dispersion of disciplinary power allows for it to be executed not only in one place in particular, but anywhere in general. A prison can be created anywhere if you use electronic ankle monitors to track prisoners. Just as a psychiatrist's office can be anywhere if it is accessed as a virtual therapist website. Just as you can work from anywhere as part of the gig economy if you have a smartphone with the right apps installed. Beyond its spatial dispersion, the temporal dispersion of power allows for it to be continuously applied without break or pause. No longer is there a particular set of hours where you attend school, another set of hours where you work, and another set of hours where you shop. Instead, you can always be studying, working, and shopping remotely on networks. And if you'd like, you can even do these things simultaneously as tabs in your browser, as apps on your devices, or as software on networks. One of the impositions of control societies is that we never have to stop working, studying, playing, or shopping for the rest of our lives. The informatics of domination compel us to constantly retrain ourselves with new skills, apply for new short-term precarious jobs, and buy the latest version of the iPhone. The confessional and surveillance dynamics that animated disciplinary societies, within which subjects were monitored as well as coerced into articulating their interior lives, pale in comparison to the ways in which individuals involuntarily reveal themselves and confess to machines in control societies. Microfacial expressions, pulse rates, body temperatures, perspiration, respiration, eye dilation, and odor are all now targets of automated machine sensing. As more of life comes to be networked, networks come to know more about life, and as more of life comes to be known by networks, networks hold more power over life. The reciprocal production of knowledge and power upon which disciplinary institutions were founded becomes fully automated in control societies. Attention itself has become a central form of confession in control societies, where the amount of time spent looking at various content online is measured by the millisecond in order to build data profiles, determine your preferences, predict your desires, calibrate the delivery of future advertisements and content, and triggering a corresponding series of control responses. All that is sensible by machines is approached as constituting part of a planetary polyphonous confession, within which subjects engage in an endless autobiographical monologue in the form of the communications and signals that are collected by network systems. Epistemologically, societies of control do not comprehend subjects as individuals, as the indivisible, discrete entities of disciplinary societies, but rather only as bundles of dividual characteristics that can be unique to particular bodies, but are more often shared in common by many. Datasets of dividual characteristics can be composed of biometric data, such as height, weight, eye color, skin color, hair color, genomic markers, fingerprints, and gait, but can also incorporate any information that can be digitally stored in a database, such as citizenship, sexuality, criminal records, or location histories. Consider this talk which is happening right now. As this video is being streamed across public and private infrastructures, traversing underground fiber optic lines, and passing through corporately owned and run servers, and then streamed to everyone who has logged in to view it, large amounts of data are being collected, analyzed, and stored. On the one hand, the video and audio that is being streamed across these networks is being analyzed by computers and various pattern recognition algorithms that are trying to detect things like copyrighted music in television programs, or terrorist groups' names and logos, or nudity, or faces, or text that it can read, or even public landmarks that can be used to help geolocate the image. On the other hand, everyone who connects to watch this video is having their IP address logged, their location approximated, their internet browsers fingerprinted, their account profiles elaborated upon, and their computer's technical information documented so they can be recorded as having viewed this talk and could be subsequently tracked across other parts of the internet. This data is then stored indefinitely and is sold to other companies who may choose to do a diverse range of other things with it. Of course, this doesn't only apply to this talk, but also takes place whenever we read, post, watch, or buy anything online, when we carry our cell phones around with us through cities, and when we pass by diverse kinds of digital sensors as we move through streets, ride the subway, or drive on highways and roads. The informatic organization and expression of power takes shape in banal and everyday forms, just as it is manifest in punctuated moments of extreme violence that characterize sovereign power. It can be expressed as the serving of particular kinds of advertising content to people who have become associated with particular kinds of individual characteristics, just as it can take shape as a military drone strike that is executed based solely upon the analysis of individual data, such as the suspicious movement of a cell phone over a time, without even being aware of the identity of the person being bombed, as has happened in Afghanistan. In these ways, societies of control and the informatics of domination are both totalizing and differential in their enactment. They are totalizing in the sense that everything and everyone can be targeted by the expansive digital sensing of surveillance apparatuses. Rich and poor, white and black, human and animal, subject and object are all equally tracked on networks as pieces of data. The cybernetic systems of Google Maps guide us through cities, just as the cybernetic systems of corporate farmers steer herds of cattle through fields. And yet, crucially, the measures that are activated in response to that sense data are fundamentally differential, because they are differently enacted in relation to politically differentiated subjects. Near the end of her essay, Haraway laments the accelerated intensification of control power, noting that the only way to characterize the informatics of domination is as a massive intensification of insecurity and cultural impoverishment, with common failure of subsistent networks for the most vulnerable. Because individuals are simply treated as nodes of a network, they can be subjected to algorithmic commands, but can also simply be disposed of. And as larger biopolitical forms of care, such as the public health systems, are defunded and dismantled and replaced with smartphone applications, that care work can be offloaded from the networked economy and onto women's largely unpaid domestic labor. In Amazon distribution warehouses, the packages and the workers are processed together on the same kinds of computer servers, both as variable data points in an algorithmically managed workplace. In control societies, the means of production have become indistinguishable from the means of control. And so individuals and commodities alike can be tracked, sped up or slowed down, and their volume can be modulated at will. When a worker falls ill or is hurt, they can be let go, and their tasks can be computationally redistributed to other warehouses and workers as needed. The informatics of domination are mobilized differentially against distinct classes of subjects based upon how distant their individual characteristics are from the calibrated settings and norms of the larger social system. In this sense, rather than produce new kinds of inequality, the informatics of domination should be thought of always as being an intensification of already existing inequalities and forms of domination, and a dramatic increase in the forms of precarity that structure our lives. While data is collected about everyone in its societies of control, that data is principally used as a power over those who are already subordinated in our society, such as immigrants, queers, sex workers, the poor, minorities, and other racialized and sexualized others. In their text, The Cybernetic Hypothesis, published in 2001, the French collective Decoun elaborated on theories of societies of control and the informatics of domination, arguing that they were governed principally by the logic of cybernetics, within which biological, physical, and social behaviors could be approached as something integrally programmed and reprogrammable. Consider how the power of disciplinary societies is rather blunt in its execution. A school curriculum or a prison architecture can only be applied uniformly on large parts of the population at a time. What distinguishes control societies in this sense is that their power can be applied distinctly at the scale of each individual, guiding and reshaping them in particular ways depending on their sensed and analyzed behaviors. Illustrative of this dynamic is the way that social media profiles can now be used as part of the process of evaluating visa and refugee applications, as well as granting bank loans. If particular keywords or images are detected by machines, such as typos or obscene language, or photos of alcohol or drugs, applications can be sorted differently, interest rates can be shifted, new forms of review can be activated, and processing times can be adjusted. And all of this can be implemented in entirely automated fashions. There is no singular architecture of power imposing itself uniformly upon a population here, but rather an algorithmic multiplicity of uniquely calibrated modulations executed uniquely in relation to each particular subject. The structures of informatic domination and control are profuse and continue to become more elaborate each year, but they are not totalizing, nor are they invincible. In relation to these new forms of domination that impose themselves everywhere, I'll now turn towards postulating various practices of resistance that have the potential to counteract these new kinds of computational power. What comes next, then, is an attempt to at least partially answer Haraway's call to articulate a politics rooted in claims about fundamental changes in the nature of class, race, and gender in an emerging system of a world, a politics which are rooted in what I call the informatics of resistance. What is uncontrollable today? What is the remainder of control? What escapes and eludes control? And what threatens to undo it entirely? In other words, what is out of control, both emerging from control as well as mobilized against its imposition? The remainder of my talk today is guided by the understanding that resistance is a fundamentally speculative endeavor, for if we already knew how to dismantle control, control would have already been dismantled. We should remind ourselves that we are still in the embryonic stages of the informatics of domination, and so are still in the experimental stage of understanding what new forms of resistance could resemble, and could become possible. Consequently, what I will try to articulate here should not be understood as prescriptive and by no means as exhaustive, but rather as a probing of the boundaries of resistant possibility. Importantly, rather than depend entirely on theory to articulate possible forms of resistance, I will also be focusing today on those who are already resisting as a means of exploring the informatics of resistance. The practices I'll be highlighting going forward will principally concern the practices of migrants in the context of the European Union, not because I intend to fetishize or romanticize migrants, but because, drawing upon an insight from the philosopher Baruch Spinoza, those who are most affected by power are also those who most closely and deeply have knowledge of power's operations and forces. As such, the choice to emphasize migrant resistance is meant to help multiply new opportunities for the adoption and development of those practices, as well as multiply possible acts of solidarity with them. All of these practices of resistance share in common a turn towards opacity that is formally asymmetric to the transparency of control societies, a turn towards secrecy that cannot be captured by the networked communication of control societies, and to turn towards diverse multiplicity that cannot be flattened out by the computational abstraction of control societies. When imagining resistance to informatic domination, Donna Haraway embraced the figure of the cyborg, a hybridization of the biological and technical, which she understood as having the potential to disrupt and undermine control. As she describes, cyborg politics are concerned with the struggle against perfect communication and a struggle against the one code that translates all meaning perfectly. Cyborg politics insist on noise and advocate pollution. This position, oriented against the communication of information systems and against the totalizing code of computation, posits a resistance against control that emerges both from within and yet against its structure. Drawing upon these insights, in the final section of the cybernetic hypothesis, Tikkun also articulates a series of measures they think can help develop an informatics of resistance. They write that interference is the prime vector of revolt, seemingly echoing Haraway's invocation of noise and pollution, and then going on to elaborate that fog is a vital response to the imperative of clarity and transparency, which is the first imprint of imperial power on bodies. The ultimate aim of these practices is to establish zones of opacity where people can circulate and experiment freely without bringing in empires' information flows, recreating the conditions for experience which will not be immediately flattened out by a binary machine, assigning all meaning and direction to it. Haraway, Tikkun, and Deleuze all locate the possibility of resistance against the informatics of domination in forms of opacity and non-communication that amplify noise, evade control, and interrupt flows of information. In the European Union, migrants have already begun the project of experimenting with and collectively developing a repertoire of practices that adopt similar orientations against the informatics of domination, and which can serve as models for future acts of resistance. In response to all the ways that contemporary migration is now controlled by networked computation, migrants have found ways of cultivating zones of opacity and contribute to the larger struggle against perfect communication, helping to constitute spaces opposed to the circus of control and the informatics of domination. The first and most popular of these strategies is the use of encrypted communication technologies by migrant communities that allow for forms of coordination and information exchange that are effectively opaque to surveillance systems. Smartphones are used to establish secure communication channels with smugglers that help to facilitate migration into the European Union, a process that at times involves some degree of exploitation, but also has undeniably liberatory characteristics. Schematic maps of safe migration paths into the European Union that graphically diagram the various steps and phases involved in the crossing of the many different borders, as we see here, illustrate ways of evading the many different security forces and architectures of the European Union, and are widely circulated between migrants and encrypted group chats. Once migrants arrive in the European Union, those encrypted communication channels subsequently provide a means to connect with other migrants and establish new migrant communities that don't expose them to the scrutiny or violence of national authorities. This widespread use of encryption by migrants is a means of becoming opaque to the computational scrutiny and analysis and refusing surveillance and transparency, and should be thought of as an asymmetric response to the black box algorithms of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and control systems that are used to police and subjugate migrants. Beyond the encryption of communication, migrants also engage in the mass destruction and mass forgery of various identity documents in order to refuse the transparency imposed upon them by societies to control. Frontex organizes to counteract these practices that it claims can ultimately undermine its internal security by deploying specialized document experts at the EU's border in order to tackle the phenomenon in a comprehensive way by police, border and coast guard, and custom experts. In a survey conducted on the challenges of identifying migrants, EU member states were asked, quote, "Are there good practices or challenges in your member state regarding detecting ID fraud?" In response, Luxembourg wrote that the main challenge is the amount of doubtful documents which make a huge backlog, seeing that there is not sufficient personnel in the special unit of the police to control all of them, while Estonia simply stated that there are no good practices to outline. The overloading of communication system with the noise of false document submissions, as well as the simulation and multiplication of false identities that are enacted through document destruction and forgery, are strategies presently being deployed by migrants in mass to undermine systems of control in the EU. In addition to the practices described above, migrants have participated in the production of spaces at the fringes of the European Union that help to facilitate their migration across the EU's borders. On the northern coast of Morocco, near the Spanish enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla, migrants from across Africa have established informal communities and forests where they're able to avoid the repression of Spanish-funded Moroccan security forces, as well as make preparations to attempt to cross over the layers of fortified and heavily surveilled barriers that are erected between the two territories. These spaces have made it possible for migrants to share and reflect upon strategies concerning how best to evade the ever-shifting border technologies of the European Union, acting as sites of resistant knowledge production and circulation where collectively produced memory of movement can persist, even as individual migrants circulate in and out of the area. This spatial otherwise to the zones of control established by Frontex allows for the practices of individuals to accumulate and contribute not only to particular acts of migration, but also to the larger historical movement of migrants that is oriented against the instantiation of control power and is beyond its communicative and transparent logic. Alex Rivera's 2008 science fiction film, Sleep Dealer, proposes its own modes of resistance. The narrative is set in a dystopian future where populations living in an impoverished and dispossessed global south log on to networks to control robotic laborers that work in wealthy enclaves in the global north. Heavily militarized and policed borders prevent migration between the two zones, and rivers have been cut off by dams, which accelerates the desertification of the protagonist's home in Mexico, devastating farming communities and their practices of subsistence and survival. At the film's climax, the protagonist of the film is able to hack into the command and control structure of the corporations that manage the architectures of control, and in so doing is able to reroute a drone to destroy the dam that was built at the border between North and South. The film should ultimately be understood as a diagram of the informatics of domination, but more importantly, as a fictive mapping of informatic border regimes that serve as the central laboratories for the logistical deployment of control power today, revealing that potential resistance might find ways to turn the informatics of domination back on itself. The American artist Ricardo Dominguez is in collaboration with other artists and programmers going under the name the Electronic Disturbance Theater, has orchestrated virtual sit-ins as a means of disrupting the flows of information that characterize control societies. Using FloodNet, a web application that was written to flood website servers with internet traffic, people from across the world acted together to block access to various corporations and governments' online presences. Notably, in 2001, tens of thousands of people participated in just such an action in order to disrupt Lufthansa's website, protesting the migrant deportations from Germany that the company had helped to facilitate. The virtual sit-ins enacted by Dominguez are both public and participatory, evoking the history of civil disobedience in the United States and connecting thousands of participants from across the planet with the objective of disrupting and disconnecting flows of informatic power. Importantly, his practice is both highly visible in the sense of its enactment as a mass protest action, but also seeks to maximize a certain kind of disconnected capacity by blocking, essentially, these corporate and government websites. Just as factory workers were understood as having the potential to undo the industrial capitalist system that produced them as proletarian subjects, so too should migrants be understood today as having the potential to abolish the systems of informatic control that produce them as illegal and thus detainable, deportable, and ultimately disposable subjects. One of the potential dangers of analyzing power is that we see its structures and movements in more detail, we can come to feel increasingly powerless to resist it. And yet, we must struggle to never forget that power always imminently contains forces directed towards its eventual undoing. The forms of transparency, connection, and communication that are imposed upon us in the form of the informatics of domination always prefigure the forms of resistance that can undo them, revealing practices and ways of living that are incommensurable with power as is presently constituted. In this sense, all of the theories and critiques I tried to outline for you today should be understood as gestures towards the perpetually renewed possibility of emancipation, towards a moment when practices of resistance can finally come to dismantle the forms of power that they first arose in relation and response to. Thank you.